been a while since I did my last Marvel Select action figure review, so today I'm going to be taking a look at the recent Disney Store exclusive Moon Knight figure. Now, I should start the review by pointing out the fact that this figure is based on the Disney Plus series version of the character. This is an important distinction because, of course, we have already had a Moon Knight figure from Marvel Select in the past. And it's important to note the era in which this figure was released. This was up for sale in the early 2000s, I think it was roughly around 2009, that sort of time. And obviously, the world of action figures in this scale at that time was very, very different. And the Marvel Select line was very different in terms of their approach. They had historically always been much more statuette focused, having a lot less articulation, but much more focused on the detailing of the sculpting and the paint apps, when much more meticulous and having nice diorama displays usually with their figures. Of course, around this time they started to increase the articulation, and eventually, of course, will go on to rapidly up their game in all departments as the years went on. And of course, this version of the character was very much based on the Moon Knight in the comics at the time. I think, if memory serves, this was the Charlie Houston run around that sort of time, and so of course we have that look represented in this figure. Now, the reason I mention all this, of course, is because this figure is essentially a re-release of that figure, but it is painted very differently and, of course, comes with different accessories. So I just want you to keep that in mind because I will be referring back to it as we go with this video. So first things first, let's take a look at the packaging. And the first thing I want to comment on is that this is actually a much more streamlined, much thinner packaging than we're used to seeing from Marvel Select traditionally. Usually they have those big giant clamshell packages which are quite sturdy and quite thick. It still has that same appearance looking at it from the front side, but as we'll see when we look at the side panel, this is a lot thinner. And we've seen this recently from a few different Disney Store exclusive releases where they've definitely trimmed down the packaging. And I think overall that's good news because it does mean that they're a little bit easier to store and that you can get a few more on the shelf when you put them on the side. Obviously the packaging is mostly window display. There's a thin banner on the side there giving us the name of the character. There is the logo or icon of the character in a sort of triangle sticker at the base of the packaging there, but most of this obviously is just highlighting the figure. Now, as I mentioned on the side panel, of course, this is a lot narrower than we're traditionally used to seeing, but there's still plenty of space here to put some nice artwork, and they have done that and maximised that. There's no text whatsoever, so this looks visually very appealing. This is great when you stack them up on a shelf next to the other figures in the collection. I think always looks really stunning, and I love when they use authentic comic book imagery, and this image I think is taken from one of the more recent Moon Knight runs. I think it was Moon Knight Legacy, and looks very striking and very nicely presented. Now, interestingly, they have gone from a comic book image rather than an image from the TV show, so I could be wrong in my assumptions that this is based on the TV show, but we'll look at that a little bit closer when we look at the figure itself in terms of the colourings and markings and the costume, because as we'll see, this image here doesn't strictly correlate to the figure in the packaging. And we can see that again when we look at this image on the back of the packaging. And I have to say, beautiful image, again taken directly from the comic books. I really love this in terms of the presentation. This is really visually striking. I love the other comic book images in the background that it's overlaid against as well. I love that the text is very small and not really dominating this image at all, which is great. So fantastic to put on display, fantastic image. But again, crucially, this image here doesn't really correlate with the figure that's in the packaging. So let's move on to the figure itself. Now, the first thing I will say is that he certainly looks like a figure that was produced over 10 years ago, and I think that is immediately obvious when we look at some of the joints they've used on this figure. But before we get into that, let's look at the sculpting. I have to say the sculpting is really, really nice. From what I can tell, this looks to be pretty much the same figure as was released previously, but the colouring is very different. We have a lot more grey and white washes running through this, particularly when it comes to the face mask itself. Obviously, that is a clean white and it is consistent with the rest of the costume. You will notice that we have this gold crescent on the chest, which is what leads me to think that this is obviously to tie in with the Disney Plus series, hence obviously why it's getting a release now as well. And yet, strictly speaking, it doesn't really adhere to what we see on screen in that TV show. Yes, we have the gold in there, and we have something of an attempt to look more like bandages around him, but the costume clearly is very, very different. And as a result, we have a figure here whose origins or source material isn't really quite clear. He's not quite the Disney Plus Moon Knight, but he's also not the Moon Knight from the comic books either, because this isn't very obviously one or the other, although I do think the attempt is to tie it into the TV show. Really, I'm basing that purely on the gold that is applied to this figure and some of the colouring on the costume. The sculpting for the most part is very, very nice. There's lots of detail in there. We can see the veins bulging out of those muscles. It is nicely textured in terms of the way it feels as well. There's lots of different paint washes running through it, and I do really like these gold accents. It really helps the figure pop, and I think they've done a really nice job with the washes. So this is visually quite striking. I think they've done a very nice job of it, but as I said, there is this feeling of it doesn't quite belong anywhere. It's not quite authentic to any one particular source, and so that might leave some collectors feeling pretty cold. The other major issue I have with this figure though is that it does feel a little outdated in terms of the articulation and the joints that have been used. For the most part, this is okay. It's a disappointing that there's no ab crunch there in the chest area at all, and that we're stuck with just a swivel at the waist, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But overall, the general look is absolutely fine, but what really sticks out like a sore thumb is the ball joints in the hips there. Obviously this is very much of the time. This is something we don't really see a lot of these days, and it does feel a little bit, well, incongruous. It sticks out. It's just not attractive at all. And toy companies have come a long way when it comes to hiding these kind of joints and disguising what this looks like. Likewise, there's something very clunky about the feet on this figure and how they connect to the ankles. It just looks a little bit obvious in terms of the joint there and not the most seamless. Also, as we'll see in a moment, the lack of articulation in some key places is very striking by today's standards, especially from Marvel Select, who have really upped their game in recent years to compete with Marvel Legends and the like. And we can really see that particularly on these hands here, where they just have a swivel. But that said, they do look very nice. As I said, the paint job and the paint applications on this figure are actually second to none. I think they've done a really nice job of that. The cape and cowl is all one piece, which is obviously going to hinder articulation when it comes to the head, and the cape itself is very, very stiff. There is a little bit of flexibility in there, but you can't really pose this at all. So I've touched on quite a lot already about the articulation, so let's run through it. He does have a ball joint in the head, so he should in theory be able to turn his head from side to side and look up and down, but obviously this is massively hindered by the cape and cowl, which is a separate piece. You could remove the cape, but then the figure's going to look pretty strange without it. He does have ball joints in the shoulders, of course, so that means he can lift his arms up and out, which is good, and this is complemented by an upper bicep swivel, which is great. He does sadly only have a single joint at the elbow, so he can bend his arm to 90 degrees, but again, looks a little bit outdated. And then there is just that swivel at the wrist, which is disappointing. Would have been nice to have had a pin swivel here with a hinge. He's got that swivel at the waist, but no ab articulation, as we've talked about. He's got those ball joints in the hips, which look pretty awful. He can kick his legs out to the side. He does have that upper thigh swivel as well, which is good, and of course he can kick his legs forwards and backwards. And then there's another single joint at the knee there that allows his lower leg to kick to about 90 degrees. And then he does have this articulation at the ankle, so the foot can hinge forwards and backwards, and there is a swivel there, so he should be able to hinge his foot to side, but it looks a little bit clunky, and it was never really truly very successful back in the day. Now, much like his predecessor, he does come with a couple of extras, although they are completely different. He has two crescent batarangs, and this Egyptian display base. I've got to be honest, I think this is really disappointing. The first release of this figure came with a fantastic statue of Khonshu, which was lovely. This, on the other hand, just doesn't really compare. It's not much of anything. It's just a ruined pillar. It doesn't have any peg holes for the figure to stand on to make it look imposing, and no matter what I really do with him, whether I stand him in front of it or behind it, it doesn't look really that good, doesn't look quite to scale, and it doesn't really seem to add anything really to this figure. It doesn't make him look more imposing, it doesn't really create an interesting diorama or environment for him to be in. It's just kind of nothing, in my opinion. That said, I do really like his moon boomerangs. I think they look really nice. It's nice that we have a silver one and a gold one, and they look really good. He holds them perfectly well in his hand, which of course is sculpted to hold them, and I think this looks nice. As I said, the paint apps on this figure are great, and when you look at him in this context, I think it stands up pretty well here. Now, as a point of reference, I did want to point out that Marvel Legends will be producing their own Disney Plus version of Moon Knight soon. So this is kind of a cheeky comparison because, of course, the images that we have for the Marvel Legends version of this figure are just digitally rendered. They're not the actual toy, so it's very difficult to put them side by side and compare them. But what we can see clearly is a lot more attempt to be faithful to what we see on screen. This new version of the Marvel Legends figure is obviously being sculpted deliberately to replicate what we see on screen. It is a new figure, it's a brand new sculpt, whereas what we have with Marvel Select is, well, essentially a cash-in, where they're taking an already released figure and just changing the paint apps to try and make it look like the Disney Plus TV show. But here he is standing next to another Marvel Legends, just to give you a sense of scale. Here's an earlier comic book version of Moon Knight that was released a few years ago from Marvel Legends, and as you can see, obviously they're in a different scale, but I have to say, I really love this version of the character, this comic book version. I really love this figure in particular. It's my favourite Moon Knight that's been released to date, and I love all the accessories that he comes with. Just absolutely tons. He has his bow staff, he has a number of different sized crescent moons to throw at people, and even alternate heads and hands and all sorts of goodies. So this for me is the ultimate Moon Knight so far. So then, in terms of a rating for this figure, I'm afraid I'm going to have to give it 2 stars, which is a pretty low rating from me. In terms of the good things about this figure, certainly I think the paint apps are excellent. I don't think the sculpting is at all bad. There's quite a lot of detail in here, which is, of course, what Diamond Select are famous for doing in this line in the early days. My greatest problem really with this figure is that it feels like a figure out of time. This was absolutely fine back in the day, but to release it in 2022 as a new figure, obviously just doesn't really work. Lots of things just stick out, particularly those ball joints at the hips, the lack of articulation that we're used to seeing from Marvel Select these days, and it just really hurts the figure. And I think ultimately as well, one of the things that's really detrimental to this release is the fact that it's not quite screen accurate. It's not authentic to what we see on screen. It is clearly the older figure just repainted to try and make it look like it is specifically from the Disney Plus show, even though they don't announce that on the box. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.